Totally Rad magically appeared on your NES back in 1990. Developed and published by Jaleco, Totally Rad was one of those games that kinda came out toward the end of the NES's lifespan, and sadly went unnoticed by the majority of kids that were moving on to the brand new Super NES. But Jaleco went ahead and brought Totally Rad over from Japan anyway, in the hopes that they might be able to sway a few kids its way with some unique gameplay based around using magic abilities and slathering it with multiple codes of early 90s pop culture absurdity. So was Totally Rad just as, well, totally rad as its name applies? Or is this a case of trying a bit too hard to cater to a particular audience that never cared anyway? Well, grab your favorite magic hat and surfboard, because we're about to see if Totally Rad is as gnarly as it wants you to think it is. Turn the game on and you get one of the most cringe-worthy early 90s video game stories ever imagined happening in front of you. Basically, our hero Jake is trying to learn magic from this guy, only to be interrupted when his girlfriend is kidnapped by some totally bogus mutants. As you're watching this unfold, you may have noticed that the dialogue completely reeks of Bill and Ted's surfer lingo. You all remember Bill and Ted, right?
How's it going, Royal Ugly Dudes?
Put them in the iron meat.
Excellent!
Execute them.
Bogus.
Yeah, those guys. And if you were around back when that movie came out, you already know how every kid in the country was suddenly trying to talk like a stoned-out homeless surfer. Totally Rad has taken that concept and completely ran for the finish line with it here, as every single line of dialogue in the game that isn't spoken by, this guy, is totally righteous. Hell, even the instruction manual is written this way. Actually, let me take a second just to show you this manual, as whoever wrote it was either ordered to do this or locked himself in a room with a Word document and then went totally insane. It even has a part where it tells you to completely ignore what's written because it's so boring, and then includes a picture of the guy's girlfriend for some reason. This is some wacky stuff, even for an NES game. After you're done cringing so hard that you can't even move anymore, then go ahead and press the start button to start your totally awesome adventure. If you're totally radical enough to actually start playing the game, you'll find yourself controlling Jake in one of the more colorful action platformers on the NES. Seriously, I had to actually turn my color down just a bit to avoid being blinded by the game's super colorful aesthetic. Once you get your vision back, you'll find that controlling Jake is about as simple as it looks, with him being able to run, jump, and shoot his way through each level. Your main form of attack is a psychic blast of sorts that can be charged up into a much more powerful shot by holding the attack button down. But it can only be used on the ground, since apparently Jake isn't a good enough magician yet to shoot a charge shot while jumping. Your overall goal is to jump and shoot your way through each stage, fighting a variety of mutant baddies on your way to save your super radical girlfriend. And if that's all this game had going for it, well, it'd be fairly average, besides the so bad it's funny dialogue throughout. Thankfully though, Totally Rad has a card up its sleeve in the form of a ton of magic that Jake can use along with this psychic blast. Just press the start button to open up a menu filled with magic attacks, like being able to refill your health, stop time to give yourself a second to slow things down a bit, and even use a variety of elemental magic attacks that clear the screen of any enemies dumb enough to think magic is totally just for kids. You also get a few spells that can change Jake into a completely different character, including a birdman that can fly around the stage, a lion that has an invincible spin jump, and a fishman that can, well, swim. All of these characters offer some awesome upgrades over just using Jake, with their only downside being that you can't use any other magic spells until you change back to Jake. But using them in the right stages and on the right bosses can make things much easier than what they would have been otherwise. Being able to change into different characters, refill your health when things get rough, and use items that would normally be powerful pickups in other games whenever you want is actually really fun. But keep in mind that using each spell will take a chunk from your magic meter that sits next to your health bar. So you'll need to know when and where to best utilize those spells, since your magic meter only recharges at the end of each stage. As for stages, Totally Rad has 5 acts that are made up of 2 to 3 individual stages each, and you'll have a lot of fun using Jake and his magic to get through them. Most of the stages look like your garden variety NES levels, but learning where in each stage to best utilize Jake's magic attacks goes a long way in making each one fun and distinct. For instance, it's totally plausible to use Jake in this underwater section, but you can also switch over to the fishman to access the platforms that run across the top of the stage. This goes along with just about every area and gives the game a very pretty open-ended feel to it, as you can always experiment with different spells if a particular section or boss is giving you a headache. The bosses themselves definitely deserve some mention here, as each one is just as ridiculous as they are massive. Their size and spectacle sadly doesn't translate to being very challenging though, as most are easily brought down with some well-timed shots and jumps, or simply saving your magic so you can stop time over and over to beat them to death while they're frozen in place. The game overall can still be fairly challenging, so this definitely won't be one of those games you'll beat on your first playthrough. Thankfully, it's enjoyable enough throughout that you won't mind mastering Jake's abilities even after the multiple attempts. If there's one thing that Totally Rad accomplishes above all else, it's showing just how awesome it was being a kid in the late 80s and early 90s, as it's the only time I could possibly ever imagine a game like this even being made without any nostalgic irony behind it. With its super bright neon aesthetic and non-stop dude-rific lingo plastered everywhere, there can be no mistake what era this game was made in the minute you turn it on. Honestly, it's one of the things I genuinely miss about that time period. It was just a big, colorful explosion of unabashed awfulness, and no one seemed to be aware of it, the least of which Totally Rad seemed to be. The game itself is overall a fairly enjoyable, well-made action platformer that has some fun with what it's trying to accomplish. And it's kind of sad that not too many people got the chance to play it, since this could have definitely been an awesome game to pick up from the video store for the weekend. There's no doubt I definitely would have loved it if I'd picked it up myself back then. For anyone wanting to check out Totally Rad in the present day though, you can usually find the cart by itself on eBay for an affordable price, especially considering how rare it was back in the day, and I definitely think it's worth the asking price. You not only get a decently fun game, but you also get a time capsule of sorts that'll put you right back in the middle of early 90s pop culture, for better and worse. So do yourself a favor and pick up a copy of Totally Rad. It may not be quite as awesome as the title suggests, but I can guarantee you that the entire package is indeed totally bodacious. Nosferatu descended from Dracula's castle and onto your Super NES back in 1995. Developed and published by Seta Corporation, Nosferatu was definitely one of their more ambitious games up to this point. And if you're scratching your head as to who or what Seta Corp actually is, well, the only other game you've probably ever heard of them developing was the woefully terrible Wizard of Oz game for the Super NES, with the rest of their lineup mostly consisting of Japan-only releases and a bunch of Mahjong games. So when screenshots of Nosferatu started hitting Western magazines, it definitely caused a few people to take notice with its super detailed and dark-looking take on the classic Dracula story. Well, it would have caused people to take notice had the Sony PlayStation not launched just a few weeks before Nosferatu released here in the West, effectively making it DOA as soon as it hit store shelves. But just because most everyone missed out on it back then doesn't mean we have to miss out on it today. So is Nosferatu still worth hunting down? Or would you be better off playing that Wizard of Oz game? Well, grab your favorite hammer and steak, because we're about to see if Nosferatu should rise from its grave. Start up Nosferatu and you're greeted to some really nice cutscenes telling the story. Basically, if you've ever heard of how Dracula goes about his business, then you already know that he's come down from his castle and kidnapped a girl to become his dark bride of the night. But it just so happens that Kyle, the girl's boyfriend, isn't having any of that nonsense and heads off to Dracula's castle to save her. Definitely pretty standard stuff here as far as a game featuring Dracula, but what stands out here are the gorgeous rotoscoped cutscenes that show up throughout the game. There's not a ton, but the animation quality here is top notch and really goes a long way in setting the mood and atmosphere for the game. Even little touches like how Kyle here briefly pauses before he runs into the castle goes a long way in showing character without actually saying anything. Once you're done admiring the cutscenes, then go ahead and press the start button to get on the path to finding Dracula and saving your girlfriend. Once you're brave enough to get into the game, playing Nosferatu can be just as scary as the nightmarish creatures roaming its hallways. If you've ever played a game like Flashback or Out of This World, then you should be able to handle what you're getting into here, as Nosferatu is definitely doing its best to ape those classic games as far as controls are concerned. Your character moves at a slower, more plodding pace, and every action you do in the game seems like it requires planning before you execute it, as even just basic movement can feel delayed due to the animation going through its paces. But that's kinda by design. It may not be ideal, but at least fans of something like Prince of Persia should be running and jumping around in Nosferatu without too many issues soon enough. But even once you do get the movement of your character down, you'll still need to wrestle with the game's awkward attempt at hand-to-hand fighting as your only means to deal with the monsters coming at you. And this is where things start to get rough. Pressing the attack button puts you into a fighting stance, where you can then use a variety of button combinations to pull off an assortment of moves and combos. This is fine in theory, but combine this with Nosferatu's already sluggish style of gameplay, and fighting enemies can be a truly awkward experience, with the game just not being able to register button combos as fast as you need to input them. As you can imagine, this leads to a ton of missed attacks, or just doing things like dashing through an enemy when you simply wanted to move forward a little bit. It also doesn't help that several enemies in each stage rush at you, not giving you enough time to even get into your fighting stance before you're knocked over or down into a pit filled with spikes again. Most of the time, it's simply best to avoid enemies if possible, just so you don't have to deal with the combat, and that's never a good thing to say about a game like this. You can eventually sorta get the hang of it by simply using as few attacks as possible so that the game doesn't get confused as easy, but it never feels like you have the control over your character that you need for this type of combat. Castlevania, this definitely isn't. So don't go into Nosferatu expecting a fun knockoff of everyone's favorite vampire slaying game. While Nosferatu may not nail the controls of classic adventure platformers, it thankfully gets the level design right though, making for a surprisingly fun game to make your way through if you can deal with the controls. Each stage offers large areas that are filled with traps, treasures, and puzzles, with the level design feeling like it's lifted almost directly from Prince of Persia. Most of these levels are fairly labyrinthine in design, with multiple paths through them that can either lead to deadly dead ends, or treasure filled with gems that can boost the stage time, refill your health, or make you stronger, depending on what color gems the chest contains. All of those things are definitely in short supply, so it makes exploring these levels for treasure chests actually worth your time, especially the power gems, since they alone can make dealing with enemies far easier, since you won't have to wrestle with the combat as much. And just as you'd expect from a game of this type, the difficulty can be way over the top, with every stage bringing it with one-hit kills, cheap hits from enemies, and enough spike-filled pits to make you rip your armchair off. There's definitely a lot of trial and error here, but it's generally the fun kind of trial and error, and makes for an awesome atmosphere of near non-stop dread and danger, which is perfect for the horror-style setting here. If you can manage to make your way to the end of the stage before rage quitting, you'll get a quick side-scrolling stage where you fight the boss, which you're probably already expecting to be a dumpster fire thanks to those controls. But it's actually not so bad, since the game at least gives you plenty of room to maneuver during these boss fights. But even then, it can still be kinda clunky, leading to more than a few deaths simply because you couldn't move out of the way fast enough instead of any real difficulty. If you haven't figured it out by now, then you kinda have to be a glutton for punishment to make your way through Nosferatu. But for those willing to stick with it, you'll find a rewarding time, unlike just about any game on the system. I know we cover a lot of games that come out late in a console's lifespan on this channel, but those are some of the most interesting games to look at for me, since a good majority of people never even got to play these games when they were originally released. Most of us had moved on to whatever the newest console was, and simply didn't even look for new releases on those dusty old consoles that we had already tossed into the closet. Sadly, that meant that a lot of really neat games were never even noticed or long forgotten, and Nosferatu here is a perfect example of just such a game. It received almost zero magazine coverage, no advertising whatsoever that I know of, and came out right smack in the middle of the launch of the PlayStation, which just also happened to be one of the biggest gaming launches of all time. So of course, Nosferatu had no chance of getting anyone's attention, even if it had somehow been the best game ever, which it most certainly is not. But that doesn't mean it's not worth checking out, because I genuinely think it's a pretty good adventure-style platforming game. Yes, the controls are sluggish and finicky, and the difficulty and cheap deaths are off the charts at times, but there's still a great sense of atmosphere thanks to the awesome graphics and animation, along with a lot of fun exploration-style gameplay that only a handful of games on the Super NES ever attempted. Nosferatu is definitely a callback to classic adventure platformers, so if you come into this game expecting fast-paced Castlevania-style action, then you'll be throwing your controller within minutes. But if you can stick with it and learn to master those controls as best you can, then Nosferatu is definitely one of the best obscure Super NES games to sink your teeth into this Halloween. Journey to SIlius colonized its way onto your NES back in 1990. Developed and published by Sunsoft, Journey to SIlius was actually originally created under the assumption that Sunsoft would continue to hold the lucrative video game rights to the Terminator franchise, and Journey to SIlius was going to be their first Terminator game to market. Unfortunately, for whatever reason though, those rights were sold off to LJN, leaving Sunsoft with a Terminator game that they couldn't release to stores. But instead of shelving the entire product, Sunsoft decided to retool the game just enough to be able to release it as an original game, which is how we ended up with Journey to SIlius sitting on store shelves. But was it enough of a retool to hide its Terminator skeleton underneath? Or did Sunsoft accidentally end up creating a genuinely fun original action game without needing Arnold's robotic visage plastered all over it?
I'll be back.
Well, grab your favorite top secret data disk left by a dead family member, because we're about to see if Journey to SIlius is worth the trip. Start up Journey to SIlius and you'll get to see one of the few things that Sunsoft actually ended up changing for the final game, that being a completely different plot that sorta fits into what you're doing. Essentially, you play as Jay McCrae, yes, that's his real name, not even being Cray, whose father was murdered by terrorists in an attempt to stop the colonization of other planets. Jay finds a data disk at his dad's house containing all of the colony plans, along with a request from his father to protect other, less destroyed colonies from the terrorists. It's just a shame you never get to ask him why the terrorists and colonies all look straight out of a Terminator game though, but I think we already know the answer to that anyway. After you're done setting course to the nearest space colony for revenge, go ahead and press start and get ready to blast your way across SIlius. Getting into the game is about as simple as you'd expect, with Mr. McCrae being able to run, shoot, and jump his way around the 5 different levels on offer. The main thing that sets Journey to SIlius apart from other games of this type is its persistent inventory of guns that you can choose from once you find them. Unlike most games where just finding weapons grants you its use until you die or use up its ammo, Journey to SIlius gives you a new weapon toward the end of every stage that will then be selectable via the inventory screen whenever you need them. This includes your standard assortment of firearms like a shotgun that can shoot in 3 different directions, a homing missile that searches out targets, along with a few others like machine guns and lasers. Unfortunately, just because you have the ability to select them at any time doesn't mean you can use them constantly, as each gun besides your standard pistol relies on one single energy bar that's located just below your health. And since that bar drains pretty quickly regardless of what gun you use, most weapons will need to be saved for specific situations where they're useful, instead of just using them to blow past enemies whenever you want. Because, you know, that would actually be the fun thing to do with a selection of cool weapons. You can at least grab energy power-ups from dead enemies, but these can be completely random drops that don't show up too often, so you may either find yourself with a ton of energy that you don't even need, or absolutely none on the same stretch of stage. It ends up being an all-or-nothing gamble, which sadly means it's usually best just to use the standard pistol until you really need to use one of the other guns. I really don't mind draining energy for using the guns, but I kinda wish each gun used its own separate energy bar. That would have at least given me more options in what I could have used and when, but since they're all tied to the same energy bar, I was constantly conserving ammo, and ultimately not using the one neat gimmick that the game has. As mentioned before, Journey to SIlius is only 5 levels long, and probably won't take you too long to make it through thanks to stage checkpoints and, thankfully, infinite continues. But what's on offer is actually pretty fun to shoot your way through, since every level offers a decent amount of variety in both design and enemies that populate them, with new enemies popping up in every stage, which is always a nice bonus. It's also obvious that Sunsoft wasn't too keen on changing their game at the last minute beyond the title and plot, as all the stages and enemies could essentially be straight out of any other Terminator game. Hell, some of the stages just straight up have endoskeletons as enemies. How's that for sticking it to the man? Each stage also comes with both a mini-boss and a regular boss, but the mini-boss always seems to show up literally right before you fight the stage boss for some reason. This usually means that you'll be draining whatever gun energy you have left on the mini-boss, making for some frustrating stage boss fights using only your crappy default pistol. It also doesn't help that your gun energy doesn't refill when you die, so even if you do get to the boss and continue, you'll still be stuck using your pistol to try and beat it. If you can learn to conserve some gun energy though, and master a few cheap hits here and there, Journey to SIlius is still more than entertaining enough throughout to make up for these annoyances. At the end of the day, Journey to SIlius is a bit more interesting than what initial impressions may seem like. Taken by itself, it's a pretty fun action shooter that's a dime a dozen on the NES, with the only thing making it stand out among the dozens of other games in the genre being a persistent inventory of selectable weaponry. It's not exactly a very challenging or long game, but the action feels good and it definitely punches above its weight for a game that initially looks and sounds as generic as its title makes you want to think it is. But taking a look at it and knowing what Journey to SIlius was actually supposed to be makes for a much more interesting game. If Journey to SIlius would have come out as the Terminator game that it was supposed to be, then this would have been by far the best Terminator game released on the NES, or really any system, for quite a while. This would have been one of the rare games based on a movie license that would have actually done the source material proud, especially considering that this would have been an original take on the Terminator storyline that no one was even attempting at the time. Unfortunately, none of that came to be, and what we're left with is the biomechanical skeleton of that game with Journey to SIlius. So if you get the chance, then by all means check the game out. It may not be as polished or as tight as the best on the system, but you still get a fun little action game that'll keep you busy for a few hours. And if you squint just a bit, you may realize you're playing the best Terminator game on the NES that never got released. Ninja Gaiden slashed its way out of Japan and onto your NES back in 1989. Developed and published by Tecmo, Ninja Gaiden for the NES is loosely based on the arcade game released a year prior in 1988. And while the arcade game is heavily based around popular beat-em-ups of the time like Double Dragon and Final Fight, the NES version of Ninja Gaiden saw significant changes on its way to home consoles. Gone was the beat-em-up gameplay style of the arcade, now replaced with something much more in the style of Konami's Castlevania series of games, and sporting a brand new level of difficulty that would see countless controllers thrown across kids' rooms over the years. But were these changes needed in the first place, since the arcade game was already pretty fantastic? Or was this really the start of a now legendary franchise that would go on to see sequels, remakes, and re-releases across multiple consoles over the next few decades? Well, unless you live underneath a rock, then you already know the answer to this one. But for everyone else, go ahead and wrap your shirt around your face and grab your favorite flea market katana, because we're about to see if Ninja Gaiden for the NES can still ninja its way into our hearts. Start up Ninja Gaiden and you'll immediately get to see one of its most celebrated achievements, that being the sheer amount of story and cutscenes being thrown at you when you're not actually playing the game. While most NES games at the time were content with a brief text crawl or just making you read the story in the instruction manual, Ninja Gaiden goes all out with plot and cinematics that would make any bad 1980s anime green with envy. And if you don't skip any of it, the game has over 20 minutes worth of story and cutscenes, which is pretty crazy for just about any game back then. As a kid, I remember being floored by these story section, since it was kind of like I was watching a cartoon along with playing a game I rented. Though I have to admit that playing it for this review and being the miserable adult that I am today, I definitely wanted to move things along, since some of those exposition sections can drag on for seemingly days. It's still a really cool thing to see though, and was actually responsible for showing me that video games could tell a visual story that wasn't limited to a stage select screen. Once you're done getting hyped up from awesome ninja cinematics, go ahead and press start to begin slashing your way through the rest of the game. If you were a kid like me and had played the Ninja Gaiden arcade game extensively at the grocery store, then playing Ninja Gaiden on the NES for the first time was a pretty big shock. The NES version is nothing like its arcade counterpart in any way, besides some stage locations and bosses. As mentioned before, the beat-em-up gameplay of the arcade has been replaced on the NES with a side-scrolling action platform game that sees you running to the left and right across stages and using your sword to slice through anything in your path. While it was initially disappointing to me that this wasn't the game I thought it would be, I really didn't care after spending just a few minutes with the super fast and responsive NES controls. Not only can your character run and jump like a true ninja, but the game also gives you the awesome ability to hang and bounce off of vertical structures like signs and walls. And while it can definitely give you a fun new way to reach platforms, it can also sometimes be a bit too sticky, with your character grappling onto the side of something when you thought you'd land on the platform instead. It's something that you get used to fairly quickly though, and afterward you should be running and bouncing around stages with the best ninjas out there. While your maneuverability and dragon sword are more than capable of taking out most everything in the game with one swing, you also get some help via in-game power-ups and items. The power-ups that drop are ninja stars that make long-range attacks possible, a spin attack that can be great for attacking from above, and the always useful diagonal fire attack. All of these use power from your power gauge, so it's important to know what areas are best to save them for, since they can be the difference between quickly getting through a section or throwing your NES through the nearest window. And if you think saving them through the bosses is the way to go, then you're wasting your time, since the bosses in the game are surprisingly tepid compared to the rest of the game. Most just walk back and forth, throwing out a single attack that you can easily dodge, with only a couple really mixing up that strategy very much. So definitely don't be afraid to use those power-ups in each stage when things are starting to look their hairiest, since that's probably when they're at their most useful. You can also find standard item drops around stages that activate when you touch them, like freezing time, invincibility, and health refills. But these generally don't drop enough to make them worth counting on too often. Besides that, it's up to you and your ninja skills to make it through the rest of the game. And trust me, you're gonna need all the ninja training you can get to make it through this one. If there's one complaint that Ninja Gaiden has received since it launched, it's the absolutely brutal difficulty it throws at you throughout the game. Now personally, I like a hard NES game as much as the next guy, but there are definitely parts of Ninja Gaiden that can feel unfair, almost to the point where you have to learn to trick the game so you can make it past certain areas. Obviously, you get your standard bottomless pits and enemies placed in the most annoying spots ever that most NES platformers come standard with. But what really amps up the difficulty in Ninja Gaiden is the way the enemies can constantly respawn if you go too far back in the screen, along with how your character gets pushed back every time he gets hit. The latter will definitely have Castlevania vets reaching for their PTSD meds, but when in combination with the aforementioned respawning enemies, things can get downright impossible at times. Your best bet most of the time is to simply not kill some of the enemies, since the game won't actually respawn anything if the enemy stays on the screen, or you just get far enough for the game to forget about it and then it loads the next set of enemies. Even then though, the game is still one of the hardest on the NES, and probably shouldn't be attempted at all if you have a penchant for high blood pressure. But if you think you can deal with it, then Ninja Gaiden is as rewarding as they come when you finally do get past a section that's been making you scream at the TV for hours. If I can stop beating around the bush for a minute, Ninja Gaiden is obviously an all-time classic game that will seemingly never age. Even picking it back up for this review and playing it was like putting on an old shirt that you forgot about, but it still fits perfectly. A lot of people mention in reviews of classic games just how good they still feel, and saying that in a review isn't exactly easy to convey without putting a controller in someone else's hands and making them play it. For me, Ninja Gaiden is that one NES game that still just feels amazing to play every single time. There's a fluidity to its gameplay that just can't be matched in my opinion. And if you get into a groove, then you really do almost feel like a ninja as you barrel through enemies and jump off walls like some crazed spider monkey. Every time I pick it up, I instantly remember why it's just so damn fun. Sure, the difficulty is off the charts and can border on human torture at times, but there's so much good here with the gameplay and storytelling that I can forgive whatever shortcomings it has. So if you haven't played Ninja Gaiden in a while, or have somehow never played it, then don't think twice about picking it up. Because if there's one thing Ninja Gaiden does better than any other game out there, it's making you realize just how damn fun being a ninja can be.